Night settles over Berlin like a held breath that refuses to leave the lungs. Concrete and barbed wire stretch across the city, not just dividing streets, but dividing lives, families, and the idea of tomorrow itself. The fall of the Berlin Wall has not happened yet. In fact, for most of the world, it still feels impossible. On one side, neon light and late-night television glow through apartment windows. On the other, silence moves differently, heavier, measured, as if even sound understands it is being watched. Soldiers patrol the length of the barrier. Watchtowers blink red in the cold air. Dogs pace circuits they have learned by memory rather than command. The wall stands not only as structure, but as statement, a line drawn so aggressively that it begins to believe it is permanent. Yet beneath that certainty, something is shifting. Not cracks in the concrete, not visible fractures. Something quieter. A rumor passed between strangers at train stations. A broadcast misheard in kitchens. A sentence repeated incorrectly enough times that it begins to change meaning. Change is coming. But no one agrees on its shape. And tonight, Berlin sleeps on top of a question it does not yet know how to ask. What happens when a wall forgets why it was built? To understand Berlin is to understand division made physical. Not metaphor, not symbolism, but geography carved into daily life. After 1961, the city is no longer simply east and west. It becomes two rhythms of existence, sharing the same sky, but refusing the same future. Families wake up on opposite sides of history. Streets that once connected neighborhoods now end in silence, concrete, and armed observation. The Berlin Wall stands like a permanent interruption in the city's sentence. On the western side, storefronts shine with color and noise. Music spills into sidewalks. Trams and traffic argue with each other in motion. Life performs itself openly, almost defiantly, as if visibility is a form of proof. On the eastern side, order is precise. Movement is measured. Public life is shaped by structure and expectation. People learn to speak carefully, to listen slightly more than they speak, to understand that walls are not only made of stone, but of consequence. Between them lies a strip of land that is neither city nor wilderness. It is absence made official. Guard towers rise like punctuation marks in a long, unfinished sentence. Searchlights sweep across ground that has been cleared not for passage, but for prevention. The wall itself evolves over time, reinforced, rebuilt, reimagined, as if permanence requires maintenance. And yet, despite everything designed to make it final, it never fully stops being temporary in the human mind. Letters still try to cross it. Voices still echo through it. People still stand near it and imagine the other side not as enemy, but as missing. History, quietly, begins to lean against the structure, not to push it down yet, but to see if it moves. By 1989, the wall is no longer just concrete. It has become expectation, a structure so familiar that people stop describing it and start living around it, like weather that never changes. Yet beneath that false stillness, pressure gathers in places no patrol can fully monitor. Across Eastern Europe, systems begin to creak. Not loudly, not all at once. More like old timber adjusting under weight it was never designed to hold. Borders that once felt immovable start to feel negotiable in conversations whispered behind closed doors, in offices where the lights stay on too late, in streets where crowds begin to understand their own size. Inside East Berlin, the mood shifts first in small ways. A glance held a second too long, a question asked without finishing the sentence, the kind of silence that carries meaning because speaking it would be too expensive. Meanwhile, West Berlin watches through television screens and radio broadcasts, catching fragments of something unfolding beyond the wall's reach. It is not yet a revolution, not yet collapse. It is something more uncertain, a loosening, a hesitation in the machinery of control. The East German government tries to maintain the shape of stability. Speeches are delivered with practiced confidence, reports are carefully worded. But even language begins to feel strained, as if every sentence must work harder to hold reality in place. And then there is movement. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just people deciding, one at a time, that waiting has become its own kind of risk. Train stations grow tense with quiet departures. Border crossings become more scrutinized, not because more people are fleeing, but because fewer people believe in the permanence of stopping them. Even soldiers begin to sense that their role is shifting, though no official document has told them yet. History does not announce itself, it accumulates, like water behind a dam that was never tested for this much patience. And somewhere in that accumulation, the wall begins to feel less like a conclusion and more like a question no one has fully answered yet. It begins not with force, but with confusion. On November 9th, 1989, officials in East Berlin prepare a carefully structured announcement meant to ease pressure building across the border system. New travel rules are drafted to allow limited movement, controlled, conditional, still contained within bureaucracy. Nothing about it is meant to be immediate. But in the room where information becomes history, a single moment slips. A spokesperson, Günter Schabowski, stands before reporters. He reads from notes, uncertain of timing, unclear on procedure. Questions come fast, pressing, tightening the space around his answers. When asked when the new rules take effect, he searches the page, hesitates, then speaks words that were never meant to land this way. Immediately, without delay. The room shifts. What was intended as administrative becomes ignition. News spreads faster than verification. Television broadcasts repeat the phrase. Radios carry it into kitchens, factories, dormitories. Across East Berlin, people begin to move, not because they were told to, but because they believe they are allowed. Border guards receive no clear instruction. Phones ring unanswered. Command chains blur into silence. By nightfall, crowds gather at checkpoints along the fall of the Berlin Wall, not with weapons, but with expectation. An expectation, once shared, becomes impossible to contain. A sentence meant for paperwork has become a turning point for a continent. Dusk settles over Berlin, but the city does not settle with it. At the checkpoints along the fall of the Berlin Wall, crowds swell beyond anything the guards were trained to interpret. There are no orders that fit this moment, no protocol for expectation that refuses to disperse. People stand shoulder to shoulder, not pushing forward, but refusing to step back. On the other side of the barrier, West Berlin watches the glow of gathered bodies through television and rumor before sight. In East Berlin, border guards request instructions that never arrive. The system designed to control movement is suddenly stalled by its own uncertainty. Hours pass. The air grows heavier with repetition. Questions asked again, answers not given, commands delayed into irrelevance. The checkpoint gates remain closed, but the idea of closure begins to weaken. Then, something breaks that is not the wall itself. A decision made under pressure, unclear even to those who speak it. The gates are opened, not as declaration, but as release. At first, no one moves. Then one step, then another, and suddenly, motion replaces hesitation. People cross like they have been holding their breath for decades. Faces change at the boundary, not because the place changes them, but because the act of crossing confirms something they have always known. The division was never complete. On top of the wall, strangers stand and look out over a city that no longer behaves like two cities. Concrete that once enforced separation becomes a platform for disbelief. Some laugh, some cry. Some simply stand still, trying to understand what permanence feels like when it fails. That night, Berlin does not celebrate in a single voice. It hums, fractured and alive, as a barrier designed to define history becomes the moment history decides to move through it. Morning arrives in Berlin, but nothing behaves like morning should. Where soldiers once stood in rigid lines, there are now gaps filled with people passing through without urgency, as if the act has always been permitted and only recently remembered. The checkpoints along the fall of the Berlin Wall no longer function as barriers. They function as passage. Guard posts remain, but authority has evaporated from their edges. Some officers step aside, others simply watch. No one is sure who is still issuing commands or whether commands still matter in a city that has already moved beyond them. Families cross into each other's lives with hesitation that quickly dissolves. Strangers recognize familiar faces in unfamiliar places. Conversations begin mid-sentence as if no time has passed at all, or as if too much time has passed to count correctly. On top of the wall, people gather not to break it, but to understand it. Concrete that once enforced distance now supports presence. Graffiti begins to appear almost immediately, not as vandalism, but as testimony. This happened. The phrase repeats in different hands, different languages, different levels of disbelief. What was built to divide geography is now being repurposed by memory. The structure remains, but its meaning has slipped free of its architecture. And in that separation between form and purpose, history begins to rewrite itself in real time. The wall is no longer an ending, it is something far more unstable. A beginning no one officially authorized, but everyone recognizes anyway. Long after the crowds thin and the cameras move on, Berlin is left with something more complicated than celebration. The fall of the Berlin Wall does not resolve into a single moment. It spreads outward, becoming aftermath. Pieces of the wall are chipped away, collected, carried home. Not as trophies, but as proof that something once immovable was never absolute. Construction begins where division used to be. Streets reconnect, maps are redrawn. But beneath the practical work of reunification, something quieter persists, the adjustment of memory. People who lived on either side of the wall now share space, but not always the same version of the past. Conversations carry echoes of two histories trying to become one without losing themselves. The wall, once physical, becomes psychological for a time. Invisible lines linger in habits, in assumptions, in the way people pause before speaking certain thoughts aloud. And yet, over time, even that begins to fade, not vanish, transform. Berlin does not forget the wall, it absorbs it. Like a scar that no longer hurts but still defines the shape of the story. What remains is not division, but recognition. That permanence is often only patience measured in years, and that even the hardest borders eventually learn how to open. And somewhere in that realization, the city continues forward. No longer split, but never entirely unchanged.